Even though we call the two-cell apparatus we use as our basic electrochemical model a galvanic or a voltaic cell, in honor of Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta, neither of those two scientists ever used one that looks like what we describe. In fact, they never would have called themselves scientists either, but that's really a different story. What we're going to draw today is actually a Daniell cell, named for John Frederic Daniell, who developed this type of cell to eliminate the hydrogen gas production associated with the voltaic pile. But you'll see it has other applications for education and for experimentation. Let's create a basic layout that we might ask you to draw for a cell that supports the reaction zinc plus copper sulfate converts into copper and zinc sulfate. Both sulfate salts are completely soluble in water, so we could write this reaction as zinc and copper 2 plus ions and a sulfate ion convert into zinc 2 plus ions plus copper metal plus a sulfate ion. In this way, we can see that the sulfate is just acting as a counterion to keep the solution from becoming charged on either the reduction or the oxidation side of the overall reaction. And here's where we begin to see why the balancing method we ask you to use is so convenient. First, we break the overall balanced reaction into two half reactions. This suggests that as long as we can ensure that the electrons and the counterions can flow between the two halves, then we can actually split the cell into two physically separated half cells. Since this reaction does depend on aqueous ions, we start by drawing two beakers for the salt solution, what you'll also call the electrolyte. Into these we dip a zinc plate on one side and a copper plate on the other. Label these and connect them with a wire. At this point we can chart the flow of atoms and electrons. According to the balanced equation, zinc dissolves into solution as zinc 2+, freeing two electrons to travel through the conductor into the copper plate. The electrons are then accepted by copper 2+ ions on the copper surface. Now, if this process were to continue with no further components, the zinc solution would quickly become so positively charged that it would attract the electrons back to itself, and the copper solution would become so negatively charged that it wouldn't be able to accept any more electrons anyways. Here's where the sulfate counterion and the salt bridge comes into play. A salt bridge is a porous membrane that contains sodium sulfate or zinc sulfate, and we draw this between the two beakers as a means to allow the sulfate to transfer from one half reaction to the other. Sulfate ions are taken up from the copper half, and sodium ions deposited to keep it from becoming too negative, and the sulfate ions are released into the zinc half to prevent it from becoming too positive. The final thing we should do is state which electrode is the anode and which is the cathode. These are terms of art to identify which half is oxidizing, the anode, and which half is reducing, the cathode. You can remember which is which by remembering to label them as an-ox, or the anode oxidizes, and we can remember it with this ox, and red cat, or reduction happens at the cathode, and we'll remember it with this one.